Fear is arguably our strongest emotion, and it can greatly affect and interfere with how we perform tasks, perhaps in severe cases even cripple our minds to the point where we are unable to think properly. If we need to focus on various important tasks, while at the same time sensing an unnerving danger, or perhaps a strong urge to leave the premises, we may end up doing nothing at all while feeling completely overwhelmed. At one point in this notoriously tense horror game, I would often feel myself losing any resemblance of a thought process, anticipating and dreading what may lurk about in the shadows. I welcome you to Unforgettable Memories, an experimental series where we revisit a game and briefly talk about the strongest and longest lasting impressions, something which naturally will differ from person to person. In today's episode, we will glance back through the Mortuary Assistant, and whether you play the game yourself or watch somebody else play it, I look forward to reading your own thoughts and impressions in the comment section. Until then, here are the lasting memories of my own. The Mortuary Assistant was a short yet randomized horror game where no playthrough was said to be the same. I worked at Riverfield's mortuary where my boss suddenly and mysteriously entrusted me with a solo shift duty, and it turned out to be somewhat of a scheme, having noticed prior that something of a demonic nature had started to latch onto me, and my boss subsequently locking me in while trying to warn and convince me to fight the alleged supernatural forces before it would be too late. The workplace in question might make many players uneasy by itself. The various tasks of a mortician may come off as both delicate and macabre. Trying to focus on and indulging in these non-fictional tasks makes for an eerie horror gaming experience in and by itself, not least the act of embalming, a process performed in some countries of the real world today. By focusing on these tasks, it is easy to forget or drown out a certain looming threat that draws nearer by the minute, and following the routine of the workplace can make a sudden glimpse or hallucination much more scary, or at the very least startling. Conversely, demonic activity and possession may be so overwhelmingly dreaded that carrying out the various tasks prove to be slow or even impossible. At least that's how I felt it. As I ventured through the Mortuary Assistant, I learned that there existed many impatient demons from various houses of hell, seeking to fully possess the young protagonist as quickly as possible. Although for me, the scariest parts were rather assisting entities sent out in advance to spy on and further weaken the fresh hosts. These would occasionally be glimpsed at random, sometimes often and sometimes not at all, and their sudden and sneaky appearances were absolutely dreadful. Out of the 3 demonic creatures, can you make a guess which one made the most lasting impression on me? During my first couple of shifts, there was a shadow that would occasionally appear out of nowhere and calling for me using a familiar voice, confusing and distracting me from my tasks momentarily. The possessing demon sought to cause emotional distress by slowly digging into the protagonist's traumatic past in order to fuel the possession process, and it would appear that the Shadow Man tried to accommodate its master's wishes. There was also the woman in white, making a couple of startling appearances, being much more physical and violent, likely as to force the protagonist to enter shock, and thus making the host more receptive to possession. Then, one shift, after successfully burning one of the demons, it came to me.
Ah! Holy fuck! Jesus fucking Christ! Oh, it's stalking me. It's stalking me. That demon was up on a wall. I hate that thing. Does it look like that because I burned the first demon? Maybe that's the same demon that returns. Maybe that's why it looks like this. It looks charred. It looks grinner. It looks like it wants revenge.
The demonic entity that made the deepest imprint. The Mimic. While the other creatures lurked in the shadows and thus assumedly would get me the worst, the Mimic was simply something on a completely different level, and its brightly pale manifestations made my anxiety levels fly through the roof. Initially, I thought this was a demon that was seemingly burned in the cremation retort from earlier, as it certainly looked like a grey humanoid shape burnt to a crisp, with a grudge not quickly quenched. The Mimic was much more sneaky than the others, not to mention disturbingly flexible, unexpectedly found spying from an unnatural position on top of shelves like an out-of-place gargoyle, or stuck to the wall like an insect. In every case, the humanoid reject had already managed to get it real close to me without a sound, glaring at me with the most haunting gaze and enthusiastic smile, and when spotted, only lingering for a split second before erratically disappearing behind impossible spaces, like a spooked spider swiftly fleeing out of sight.
Formaldehyde. Or formal indeed. Ah! Holy freaking shit! Oh, that was not very formal. You're sitting there like a gargoyle.
There is not much more for me to say about this haunting Mimic. While its presence is an omen of a demonic possession, it is also the most silent and possibly even the most harmless of the three demonic entities. Perhaps it indeed is like a house spider, carefully observing those it shares a living space with and shying away when spotted. If so, it would truly empower the common saying, "It's more afraid of you than you are of it." But that is merely an encouraging thought, for should you be so unlucky as to spot the Mimic, well, I know I would be going crazy in no time. Having talked about the Mimic, I feel a craving to bring up a little something else before concluding. Consider this a bonus entry in this rather insidious Unforgettable Memories episode. The last and hopefully final time I visited Riverfield's Mortuary, there was a festive update around Christmas. And while I was not sure how much of the game was altered for the jolly season, I quickly identified one of the mortuary's patients as Santa Claus in the flesh. Sadly, not in a very merry state, as is to be expected in such a place. Tasked with processing Santa, it did not take long for me to hear sleigh bells closing in from afar, and this is when the rather festive mood took a turn for the worse. I kept on with my duties, but from that point on, I was afraid that one of Santa's reindeers would try to get into the building and not at all be happy with what I was doing to its master. This may just be my mind exaggerating things, but having seen how startling the Mimic turned out to be, I did not dare even imagining how it would be like having a pernicious reindeer glaring at me from the shadows. I kept imagining that at just this moment, a reindeer would fly down from the sky and lurk around the walls outside, trying to get in. I did not encounter anything like this at the time. I will say though that we may still get a chance to have a closer look at Santa's reindeer helper, but more on that in an upcoming Unforgotten Memories episode. So now you know the most haunting memory of my time in the Mortuary Assistant. If you would like to see my first time reaction playthrough, there will be a link to it in the video description. We all experience horror games differently though, so do feel free to share your own thoughts as a comment to this video. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my first impression memories of these tense shifts, along with a peek into why I picked the Mimic for this episode, and I do wish you a pleasant night to come. If you did enjoy listening to me pouring out my thoughts on horror games, then do feel free to stop by my Twitch interactive live channel, where I live stream most Fridays around 9 p.m. Central European Time. And you are very welcome to join for some live gameplay and random chats about horror games and atmospheric adventure games alike. For now, I wish you a pleasant night.